Hi everyone, and welcome back to the channel. If you're managing Azure Virtual Desktop, you probably use FSLogix profile containers to improve the performance and the user experience of your users. But as great as FSLogix is, we've all hit into those frustrating problems where profiles just won't mount correctly, or you just get the black screen. In today's video, we're going to tackle some of those headaches, including FSLogix VHD mount failures and black screen issues. So if you ever seen errors like profile failed to attach or unable to mount the user's profile container, you're in the right place. VHDX mount errors can disrupt productivity, extend user logon times, and frankly, they're just annoying. So the good news, they're usually straightforward to fix once you know where to look and what to do. So here's exactly what we're going to cover today. Number one, why do VHDX mount errors happen? The root cause behind the issue. Number two, how to diagnose those issues quickly and accurately using the logs and built-in tools. And then we're going to look at the practical step-by-step solutions that will get your FSLogix profiles mounted smoothly again. By the end of this quick guide, you're going to be quick to everything you need to do to resolve those FSLogix mount issues confidently and efficiently. Alright, let's get started. First, let's take a step back and see what FSLogix actually is. FSLogix is a tool which enables you to mount your profile. My profile sits in a VHD or VHDX file, and we can put that profile on a file share. When the user logs onto the session host, that profile is mounted. Any writes or reads to the user's profile is essentially redirected onto this mounted VHD file. From a Windows operating system perspective, it thinks it's just writing to the user's profile, but in reality, we're redirecting those reads and writes onto a mounted file share. What we're going to do in today's video, we're just going to basically walk through each step by step and show you how to optimize and how to troubleshoot it. FSLogix is definitely one of those tools where you can just set and forget it, and it may work perfect, or it's going to be an absolute worst nightmare because it affects every single user who's actually logging onto that session host, right? So if you've got issues with FSLogix, you're going to have a very upset user base, right? So we need to make sure that we know how to troubleshoot it. We need to make sure that we maintain it as well, okay? Because if you just set and forget it, you're going to run into issues. Each step by step down, and then we're going to look at network permissions for different authentication types. Definitely going to be a very useful video if you use FSLogix. Alright, so let's get going. The first thing we need to look at is identity, right? So what identity type do we mean for FSLogix? What do we mean by that? So essentially, FSLogix sits on a storage account, right? And if we need to access that storage account from a session host which is joined to a domain, that can either be Enter ID tenant or it can be your Active Directory services, we need to make sure the storage account matches that. If I'm accessing the Azure Virtual Desktop solution from an Enter ID joined session host, I need to make sure that my storage account is joined to Enter ID. If I'm accessing my storage account or FSLogix file share from a session host which is joined to Active Directory, I need to make sure my storage account is joined to Active Directory. So we're not going to go through specifics how to do that, but I'll show you how to check to see everything is configured as it should be. Okay, so I'm just going to flick over to the screen. So I'm just using Nerdio here just to show you a high level overview. So you can see here I've got two separate storage accounts. One of them is AD joined, so if I've got a host pool which is AD joined, I'd use this one. And I've also got one with Enter ID joined, right? So if I'm using a host pool which is joined to Enter ID, I'd use this one. So let's go and have a look and see what to check for. So if your troubleshooting is not working, you're having authentication issues, here we can have a look. I've gone into the storage account, and as you can see here, this is just a normal storage account that we've got in Azure. And what we need to do, we need to basically look at this identity-based access, right? Just to make sure that this is configured correctly. Okay, let's have a look at this one. So go to configured. Let's see, I'm just going to select that. And what I'm looking at here is where it says identity-based access configured. So I'm just going to click that. What this is telling me, it's basically telling me that my Active Directory services domain services is enabled. Okay, so that's configured on the storage account. So we just click on this, configure, and you can see here that's enabled. That's the first thing to double check, just to make sure that if you are using Active Directory domain services, this is enabled and joined to the domain. And the other thing to check for is the default share level permissions, right? So what these essentially do is any authenticated Active Directory user who's logged onto the session host will get the storage file SMB share contributed permission. What does that mean? So basically, when you access a file share, same as an on-prem file share, these two types of permissions are in place. The first one is the share level permissions, right? And this is what we're setting here, saying access to the file share is going to be the storage file data SMB share contributor. So anyone will inherit that by default. Okay. And the second permission, which we'll go into shortly, is the NTFS permissions. We have a file share, and then we've got file level permissions. Again, we're going to go through that hands-on in a second. That's the very first thing that I normally check if we're having issues, just to make sure that these are configured correctly, right? The next one we can go to is our Enter ID joint. So let's have a look and see to make sure that everything is in place for that. I'm just going to click on the storage account, and then you'll see the differences between the two different types of storage accounts. Okay, so this is my Enter ID joint share storage account. So again, we're going to go to identity-based access, and I'm going to go to configured, and in here again we're going to go to the same place. You can see I've got this FSLogix file share, and then I'm just going to go to configured. So you see the difference here, right? We've got Microsoft Entra Kerberos configured. Yeah, so that's basically saying this is Entra ID joined, and it uses Kerberos authentication. Okay, so again you can see down here we've got this authenticated user set to the share permissions. So again, I'm just going to go onto here and select that, and you can see we've got the Microsoft Enter ID Kerberos configured correctly. Okay, so what you'll notice here, it says after enabling Microsoft Enter ID Kerberos authentication, you'll need to explicitly grant admin consent to the new Microsoft Enter ID application registered in your Enter ID tenant. Right, so let's go and make sure that's done, because that's really important, especially when you're doing the Enter ID stuff. When you join your storage account to Enter ID, it basically creates a object within your Enter ID. Let's go and take a look at that now. I'm just going to open up another tab. I'm going to go to the portal, Azure.com, and we're basically going to go to something called app registrations. Okay, so if I just go to app registration, I'm going to go into here, and then go to click on all applications, and then see here I can see these storage accounts. So these are my Enter ID joint storage accounts. So let's double check to see which one this is. So this is Virtual Monk Central RAID. Let me just go and make sure this is the right one. Yeah, okay, so this is our storage account, so I should see this one here. Yeah, so I've got a application ID for that as well, so I'm just click OK. And then basically, if you just configured this, you're going to need to go to manage and then to API permissions. Now you can see here that I've already been granted this. If that's not ticked and you don't see green there, you need to select this, grant admin consent for your Enter ID domain. Okay, if you don't do that, it's not going to work. So that's very important. Now you're probably thinking, what if I don't have Kerberos? You can see here Microsoft Enter Kerberos. So any user who uses FSLogix for Enter ID needs to be synced from Active Directory. There is a workaround available. I'll put the link in the description. It's now officially supported by Microsoft, but essentially if you have an Enter ID only user, there is another way of doing this. You can mount using the storage account and give the session hosts permission to the file share. But it's only a workaround, and it's not really recommended. If you do have Enter ID only users and you want to use FSLogix, that is available. Ideally, you need to have your users synced from Active Directory. That's another troubleshooting thing to step, just to make sure that your user that you're using is a synced from Active Directory. All right, I hope that's clear. So that's the authentication and directory, right? To reiterate, there's two separate types, either Active Directory joined or Enter ID joined, and we just showed you how to check which one's configured for which. On to the next one. So that's how we do the directory authentication. Now let's look at the NTFS permissions. This thing is probably the most common cause which I see around profile man errors. Essentially, as I mentioned earlier, there's two stages of permissions. So there's the share level, which you can say there's three levels. First one is the directory authentication, right? Second one is the share level permissions, which we configured earlier. And the next one is the NTFS permissions, the actual folder permissions. When we authenticate to the storage account, we're only authenticating to the top level share. Any folders underneath that, I need to get NTFS permissions. Let's go and have a look and see how we do that. I'm just going to flick over to my other screen. So what we basically need to do, we need to mount the storage account, right? Using the iCackles. And we can look at the permissions and see what's configured. Then I'll show you the Microsoft documentation, which basically says what permissions you should be configuring. How do we do that? How do we get on and look at those permissions? We actually need to authenticate using the storage account keys. Right. Here's my storage account. We go to access keys. These keys are basically showing me what the access key is. Don't worry, I'm going to reset this afterwards, so I'm not bothered about someone hacking into my storage. There's no data on there anyway. So here we've got the access key. Select that, and then I'm actually logged onto the session host. So let's just map a network drive to the storage account. Okay. To do that, we use this command here: net use storage account name, then the share name, then the storage account key, and then the user. I've put these examples in here. That's completed. So now, if I go to K dir, I can connect to that file system. You can see there. And then that's my profile. What permissions do we need? Essentially, the permissions recommended by Microsoft are the creator owner, grant, I think that's modify, the group name if you want that in there, authenticated users, and then built-in users. So it's actually removing authenticated users and built-in users and granting either a group name or, most importantly, the creator owner permission, right? When you do the creator owner permission, what that essentially does, it means that anyone who creates that profile gets that permission, right? And then obviously this here can be your administrators. If you've got people who need to manage those user profiles, you can add those in there as well, and that'll give them modify access. So what I can do now, I can show you what permissions are actually set on there. So if I just go to iCackles, we can see there, iCackles K. And there you go, and that'll show me what permissions are actually configured. And if I want to actually look and see for that directory that you can see in there, okay, so you can see there that permissions. Now this here is going to be my SID for my user account, right? So if you look at that SID within Enter ID, that should match up because that's going to be me. And then I'm also going to have creator owner permission, which is full, which is what I've got configured, and then built-in administrators and system. If you needed to modify any of those permissions, you just go into the command, which you've got in here, and then I'd say, okay, run this. So I can basically say remove authenticated users or built-in users. So for example, if I wanted to run this, just go into here, paste. Yeah, so it says it failed 0 or process 1. That's basically just removed the authenticated user permission from there. It wasn't added anyway, but it's fine. Yeah, that's pretty much it. The important permission that you need to look at is this creator owner permission here. Right? That's a really important one that you have to select, because if you don't have that permission, then normally what happens is when the user tries to connect to the file share and basically create the user profile, it will fail. Because they don't have permissions to create that, right? This one is probably the most important one, so just make sure that this is set and configured, and also use this iCackles just to connect, just to see what the existing permissions are as well. Okay, all right, on to the next one. We've created our storage account, we've connected it to the domain, we set the share level permission, and we check the iCackles permissions or the NTFS permissions. So everything should be working now. How can we check to see whether the profile is actually mounted or not? So now I'm just going to show you how to do that. So again, we're going to go onto our screen. So there's actually a really useful tool called, so I'm just going to show you where to find that. Okay, so if you go to C, Program Files, FSLogix, Apps, and then in here you should see FRX tray. Basically, if I double click that, what that then does, if I go down into here, I can see it basically says FRX profile, FSLogix profile active. So I'm just gonna click open. Okay, all right, what this is basically showing me, it's like a green, which basically says that that's active, and it's showing me the total space and the space remaining on my file share, right? Sorry, on my individual VHD file. Click on advanced view. So that's a good thing to check as well. So sometimes a user profile can get full. When it comes to capacity, there's two things we need to think about. The first one is the capacity on the file share, just to make sure we have enough capacity on the storage account. So sometimes we may need to increase that capacity, right? So again, if we just go back to our Azure portal, so this is my storage account, and if you go here, you can see it's basically saying provision storage set to 100 gig, right? So 100 gigs, not much, so we may need to increase that. Obviously you can use Nerdio if you want to automatically increase it for you, but if you need to increase that, you can just go to provision storage there, and basically if I need to increase that to 200, I just put that there, okay, and then that would increase that. So keep an eye on this, set up an Azure monitor alert or something, because if this gets full, then your users are going to have a very bad day, because they'll get lots of weird stuff happening. That's storage number one, but the second one is the actual VHD file storage. And what do we mean by that? You can see here it says the total space is set to 29.3 gigs. This is the maximum size of the VHD file, and you can see here the size on disk is set to 1.2 gig. So let's take a look and see what that actually means. So if I go into the profile, this is we're going to go through this shortly, by the way, and then what we'll do, we'll just connect to that file share. So I'm just going to see what here the file path is. So let me just find here. So I'm just going to connect here. Okay, so copy and then paste that into there. Okay, so this here is my file. So you can see there 1.3 gigs, which is set. Now the maximum size that this can grow to is basically 30 gig. Right. If this gets full, then the user can't write any more information to it. You can extend it, but it's best to clean it out and keep it clean. That's just FYI. So if your users are getting weird stuff, just check the size of these files, as you can see here. So if you log on to a file share, you'll have lots of different users in there as well. Just double check the size of those and make sure they're not full. Okay. All right. So that's the capacity. So while we're in here, what I'm basically going to do as well is basically I'm going to walk through what happens at the logon, right? Just so you can see a figure how to troubleshoot the common stuff. So this is the log file, so you can actually find this log file in, let me just open up the tab because we'll come back to this in a second. You see program data, so we go to FSLogix and then logs, profile. So see program data, FSLogix logs profile folder, okay? And if you open this up, basically you'll get the file. So I'm going to walk through some stuff, I'm going to point out some stuff, right? And this is how, if you're really stuck, you start digging into this. And if you checked all the basics, imagine we checked all the permissions, they're okay. The next stage is to look inside the log file and actually see what's happening. And I'll walk you through this. Basically, what's happening here is when the user logs on, the first thing it checks is to see whether the user's a member of the group. So basically there's an include and exclude group on the local session host. Include is normally anyone. Exclude you can add in, right? So if you want to exclude certain people from having FSLogix profiles, maybe you're troubleshooting or something, there's a local group on the session host which you can add people into. So let me just show you what that looks like. So you see here we've got a FSLogix profile exclude include list. So if you wanted to exclude anybody from in there, you'd add them in here, include. So that's the first thing that this is checking for, to see whether an FSLogix profile actually exists. And next thing it's looking at is the actual registry settings, which we configure, right? So it's looking at HKey, local machine, software, FSLogix profiles, right? So let's go and take a look at that, shall we? So if we go to, okay, so basically this is what it's looking at, right? It's looking at these registry settings, and this is how we configure FSLogix for its behavior. Yeah, so we can see that's set to enabled, and then we can see it's the VHD location. So I've not configured much, but in an environment where you've got certain stuff that we like, the naming or maybe the profile type, we can figure that here. Okay, so it's basically reading through all of those settings. So if I go back to so basically it's reading through these settings, so it knows how to behave and how to configure and what to configure. Okay, so you can see that configuration read my path to my profile. Okay, so we're good. And then it's basically what it's going to do then, it's writing some information into the registry, and what it'll then do, it will actually then try and connect, right? So you can see here, attach VHDX successfully. Okay, so this basically means it's saying, okay, yep, I'm good, I've now attached, and then it will then proceed to read all the information from the profile on the actual session host itself, and it will create a local profile as well. So you can see here it's created CD users, and anything which is not included in the FSLogix profile, that's what it uses that for as well, right? That's another thing. Sometimes what can happen as well is if that C users doesn't get deleted, it can cause problems as well. So yeah, when you're troubleshooting, this is like really gold dust, because it tells you exactly what's happening. And normally you can come in here and you can spot an error, you can spot like something's not right and look for error messages and stuff like that as well. Any error message that you get from the console, you're going to see here. For example, I can go into here and you can see users, and then you can see there. So this is my local folder it's created. So local underscore username is basically anything which is excluded from the FSLogix profile, and that will get written into here, and then when I log off, that should get cleared down. Yeah, in theory it's all very simple, right? All we're doing is basically logging onto a profile, mounting in the profile, then redirecting and read and write to it. So what can go wrong? Right, so probably the most common issues that we normally see are the permissions not being set right. Be the shallow permissions or the NTFS permissions, but another common thing we normally get is the profile being locked, right? Because basically sometimes is what's supposed to happen is when I log off from the profile. So if you go onto into here, when we log off, it's essentially supposed to clear the file lock, right, off. So when I log on to the VM, it puts a lock on this file, right, because it's in use, it's active, I'm constantly reading and writing to it. And what can sometimes happen is it will basically get locked if you don't do a clean log off, or if you're running some kind of antivirus or something. Now you can normally just restart the session host and that clears that lock, but sometimes you have to run a PowerShell command to basically clear the lock as well. So that's definitely a common issue that we see. Another common issue that we see is basically if you try to read the profile from multiple locations at the same time. Imagine if I'm logged on to session host number 1 in host pool number 1, and I've got a read write lock on this. If I then log on and the same user into a different host pool, it'll give you an error message just saying it's already in use, and because you can't have multiple read and writes to it. And we'll show you how to do that in a second when I go through all the different options that you get. Right, so they're the most common issues that we see, but by far the easiest one to just troubleshoot is just look at what's happening through the profiles. Alright, so now let's look at the dreaded black screen issue, which we seem to get quite a lot with users. So what you need to remember is performance, IOPS, because you are reading and writing onto a file share, and we need to make sure that file share has enough performance. Okay, so what you get is, let me just go back into my console, is we have this thing called storage latency. Right, storage latency is when you don't have enough IOPS for your storage shares. Normally when we see a slow black screen logon, it's either due to a number of reasons. The most common cause is that I see is basically there's not enough storage performance to meet the user demand. Right. If I go onto this storage, for example, so let's have a look on the storage account, and then we'll try and see if we can see what the latency is of the storage, right? Because the more capacity we give the storage account, the more IOPS we get. What does that mean? If I have a certain amount of storage, I get a certain amount of IOPS, right? So you can see here I've only got 1,000 or 100 gigabytes configured, and that's giving me a maximum IOPS of 3,100 and a burst of 10,000 and a throughput rate of 110 megabits a second. Right. So the average logon IOPS for a user is about 50 IOPS, right? So if we take that, use some of my bad maths, so 3,100 divided by 50, 62 users. Okay, so if you've got 62 users logging on all at the same time, that's going to kill the maximum IOPS on that session host. Now, we're using Azure Files Premium. If you're using Azure Files Standard, it couldn't burst. So Azure Files Premium can burst in short bursts of time. So let's figure this out. So 10,000 divided by 50, that's still only 200 users, right? And that it's going to burst for. So sometimes what you have to do is you have to basically over provision the storage to get the performance that you need. So imagine if I stick that up to a terabyte, what does that give me? So you can see that's gone from 3,000 IOPS down to 4,000, or to 4,000, sorry. Maybe that's still not enough, so let's set that to 2. Whoops, lazy. 2 terabytes, 2,000. So now we've got 5,000 IOPS, right? Which is going to give us 5,000 divided by 50. Still only 100. So this one you really need to look at it. And then obviously we've got the throughput rate. So sometimes the reason why we're getting black screens or it's taking a long time to log in is because we just don't have the performance that's needed, right? So we have to give it more storage to basically get the performance it needs. So how can we get that information? So basically, if we look in here, you can see here we have latency. Okay, so if I go to performance, I have this assessor server latency and E2E latency. So anything above 15 is bad. Okay, so you need to check to see whether you are actually getting performance latency. We can go into here and we can have a look at that and see, okay, how's that storage operating, right? I've had instances where I've gone into customers' environments and this is 100 milliseconds of latency and they're wondering why they're getting slow logons. And just have a look through here as well and just see like availability, capacity as well, so we can see the amount of space we're using in here. Use all these tools to basically monitor your storage and see what's happening, because if you've got slow storage, then you're going to have slow logons and then you're going to get like black screens and all that type of stuff. It's very important. Alright, so that's how we troubleshoot the performance. So now let's go and look and see what settings that we need to set within FSLogix, because this also is a common problem where people misconfigure FSLogix. Again, I'm just going to use Nerdio here just because it's easy to look at all the settings, and then I'll explain some of the more important ones that we need to think about. So if I just go to access networking piece as an object, we only use that if we are using Entra ID only joined accounts, right? Make sure that by default that's set to 0. What other important ones are applied? Delete local profile when VHD should apply. This is quite an important one. Basically, what that will do is, by default behavior, if you log onto a session host and you've already got a profile, so maybe FSLogix has been broken or something, it will say, hey, I've already got a profile, I don't need you. What this setting will do is, if you log onto a session host and it finds that you've already got a local profile, it will delete that profile and then force the FSLogix profile. Okay, quite useful. The only downside is if there's a problem with FSLogix, then you usually won't be able to log on at all. It's interesting, but I normally recommend enabling this one. Flip-flop directory name, so this is just a naming thing depending on how you want the name to do. What else is useful? One that we normally recommend doing: prevent logging with failure. What this basically does, if there's an issue with FSLogix, it will basically stop you from logging on. Again, this is default setting is to 1. Now, I think this is actually good to turn it on. The reason being is because if you don't turn it on and there's a problem with FSLogix, then you will not be able to, you won't know there's a problem, and the users will be logging into all the session hosts with a local profile, and then they'll wonder why when they log on to another session host it has changed settings. So I have seen environments where that's happened. The users didn't know, the admins didn't know, and it went on for a while. And then you're in a problem because then you've got all these session hosts with different profile settings on them. User logs onto host number 1 and they've got a picture of their cat in the background. User logs onto host number 2 and they've got a picture of their dog in the background, and then they wonder why they don't have the same picture. All right, definitely recommend doing this. If you maybe you could turn it off, and if you're happy with that, and to get your users working, so it's open, but I prefer to have it turned on. Prevent login with temp profile. So similar thing, but if the user logs in and they have a temp profile rather than a proper profile, it won't let them log in. What else is there? So profile type is, this is something I was talking about earlier. So normally by default, only one user can access the profile at the same time. If you want the ability to basically log on to the same profile from multiple host pools, you can configure this. And what that will do, it will allow simultaneous logons, and then it's last right win scenario. I don't like enabling it because it can cause corruption issues of the profile, right? So ideally set this to 0, and then if you do have multiple host pools with the same user logging into multiple host pools, create separate profile paths. Best practice is you create one profile path per host pool, right? So definitely be careful with this one. What else have we got here, which is normally redirect.xml source folder. Don't normally recommend configuring this, but if you've got something in your profile which you want to exclude from FSLogix roaming, maybe it's you got an application which generates loads of large log files, you can configure something called XML source folder, redirect XML source folder, and that's basically just XML file which you configure exclusions in, and then from there we can say I don't want this folder path to be included with my FSLogix profile, for example. Okay. Roam identity, I think we need to turn this off by default. It can cause problems, so but I'm not too sure, so I'm not going to say anything but read up the documentation about that. Windows search database roaming, again, that can also cause some issues, so I probably recommend turning this off, I think, but again, just do some research onto that one. Size in megabytes, so this is the size of the profile. So we mentioned this is like maximum 30 gigs. This is where you would configure that if you wanted it to be bigger. So if you wanted it to, for example, have 40 gig profiles or 50 gig or 100 gig, you configure that within here as well. And then we've got volume type as well. So this is if you wanted VHD or VHDX. So ideally you should have VHDX on there as well. Office containers, not going to get into detail on that today, but basically that is a setting where you can have a separate path essentially for your Office data, so your OST file and all the temp SharePoint files, that type of stuff. So some people prefer to split that out. And the other important thing to mention is if you are using Enter ID joined, you need to have this setting here configured. So enable Kerberos ID functionality for Enter ID credentials, right? So if you go to this setting, it tells you to configure these settings here. So if you are doing Enter ID join, make sure you've configured these settings here. Okay, they're the major settings that we have that we normally recommend configuring. The only other one that I'm going to mention is around Cloud Cache. I don't normally recommend Cloud Cache. So Cloud Cache is something where you can configure it to replicate your profile to multiple locations. So it's good for disaster recovery. It complicates things. It slows the logon process, it slows the logout process, so only use it if you're after DR functionality. I have some customers who seem to enable it just for the sake of enabling it, and then wonder why they're running into problems, so don't do that. Only use Cloud Cache if you need that DR functionality, because as I say, it does add complications in there and stuff. Okay. Alright, so yeah, that's pretty much it. FSLogix can be a pain if you don't know how to manage it properly and troubleshoot it. So as I said, the biggest tips I can give is make sure you've got your identity set right, make sure you've got your share level permission set right, make sure your NTFS permissions are set right, check those configuration settings that we went through and make sure they're set to how you want the environment to behave. The other thing probably is the versions. Just in the past year or so, or the past couple of years, users have hit quite a few issues when they're updating to the newer versions of FSLogix. It's one of those products which I've started to recommend. If it ain't broke, don't touch it. Always maybe go with N-1, unless there's a specific bug issue that you've got in the latest version. Newer versions are released probably about every 6 months or so, and every time there is a new version, it does seem to cause quite a few problems. Be careful. just maybe n-1 is a good scenario. And what I mean by n-1 is don't always use the latest version straight away. Either just give it a month or two, or just stick to always using the last previous version. That's a kind of stable release, because FSLogix is one of those tools that you may think it's not that important, but when it breaks, you have a very bad day. Okay. All right. So I hope you found this useful. Please subscribe, drop some comments if any FSLogix issues that you may be having, and maybe we can help. But yeah, see you next week. Bye bye.